I caught my boyfriend in bed with my roommate. He smirked and said, "You're always at work. What did you expect?" I said, "Fair point." Then I quietly removed my name from the lease. 48 hours later, they learned who had really been paying for their life. My name is Natalie Mercer. I'm 27 years old, and until recently, I thought being dependable was one of my best qualities. I work in IT infrastructure for a healthcare company. Most people hear that and imagine I spend my days fixing printers or resetting passwords. The reality is a little different. When a major system fails, hospital staff can lose access to patient records, departments can't communicate properly, and entire workflows can grind to a halt. When something breaks, people start calling immediately. So when my phone rang, I answered. The job paid well, but it demanded a lot in return. Late nights weren't unusual. Weekend emergencies happened often enough that I stopped making firm plans. There were days I'd leave before sunrise and come home long after dark, exhausted from staring at monitors and troubleshooting problems most people never even knew existed. At first, Ryan said he admired that. We'd been together for 2 years, and in the beginning, he liked telling people how important my work was. He'd smile and say things like, "Natalie basically keeps hospitals running." Back then, it sounded supportive. A few months later, it started sounding different. "You're working again?" "I have to." "You always have to." Those conversations became more common over time. I kept trying to explain that I wasn't choosing work over him. Emergencies weren't scheduled around our relationship. I wasn't staying late because I wanted to. I was staying late because it was my job. Still, I felt guilty enough to compensate for it. I paid for most of our date nights. I surprised him with weekends away when my schedule opened up. If I got home late, I'd bring dinner. If I'd been busy all week, I'd plan something for us on my next day off. Looking back, I spent a lot of time trying to make up for problems I didn't actually create. 14 months ago, Ryan moved into the apartment I shared with my roommate, Chloe. That detail matters. The lease was entirely in my name. I'd been living there for 3 years. I passed the credit check, paid the security deposit, signed every document, and handled everything connected to the apartment. Chloe was listed as an occupant. Ryan was listed as an occupant. I was the leaseholder. The rent was $2,400 a month. Before Ryan moved in, Chloe and I split it evenly, and when Ryan joined us, he said he couldn't afford a larger contribution because he was working part-time at a coffee shop while figuring out what he wanted to do next. I believed him. Instead of paying rent, he contributed $400 toward groceries and utilities. At least, that was the arrangement. Meanwhile, I continued covering my share of rent, most of our food, streaming services, internet, and a surprising number of expenses that somehow became mine without any real discussion. At the time, it felt normal. When you're in a relationship, small compromises happen gradually. You don't notice them piling up until you're carrying far more than you intended. Chloe had been my roommate long before Ryan and I started dating, so sharing the apartment never seemed strange. For a long time, everything felt comfortable. Then little things started bothering me. None of it was dramatic or obvious at first. It was just a collection of small moments that felt strange enough to notice, but easy enough to explain away. I'd come home late and find Ryan and Chloe watching movies together. I'd walk into the living room and notice a conversation ending the second I entered. Sometimes I'd catch them laughing about something neither of them wanted to explain. I remember one night coming home to find them eating takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant. Ryan looked up and said, "We didn't know when you'd be back." At the time, I brushed it off. I brushed a lot of things off. When Ryan stopped waiting up for me. When Chloe somehow knew details about his day that I hadn't heard. When I started feeling like a guest in my own apartment after working 12 hours straight. Every time something felt off, I found an explanation. I was tired. I was stressed. I was overthinking. The alternative was admitting that I didn't completely trust the two people closest to me, and I wasn't ready for that conversation. The truth only came out because I got lucky. 3 weeks ago, I was scheduled to stay late for a server migration that was expected to run most of the night. Before leaving that morning, I'd already told Ryan not to wait up. I figured I'd get home around 2 in the morning if everything went smoothly. Instead, the vendor team finished early. Around 8 o'clock, my manager looked over and said, "Go home, we're done here." I remember feeling excited. Not because anything special was planned. Because for once I could have a normal evening. Maybe order pizza. Watch something mindless. Spend time with my boyfriend before going to bed. I didn't text ahead. I wanted to surprise him. That decision changed everything. When I unlocked the apartment door, the place was quiet. It wasn't empty, but the silence felt unusual. The living room lamp was on. Ryan's jacket was hanging over a chair. Chloe's shoes were by the couch. I barely noticed any of it until I heard noise coming from my bedroom. Not Chloe's room. Mine. I stood still for a second. Then I walked down the hallway. The bedroom door wasn't locked. That detail stuck with me afterward. Either they were completely careless, or they never imagined I'd come home early enough to catch them. When I opened the door, nobody moved. Ryan was in my bed. Chloe was with him. For a few seconds, my brain simply refused to process what I was seeing. The room felt frozen. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Then Ryan's expression shifted from shock to panic, and something inside me went strangely calm. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I didn't ask why. I turned around, walked into the kitchen, grabbed a glass, and filled it with water. My hands were shaking badly enough that I noticed it immediately. I focused on the glass because it was easier than focusing on what I'd just seen. A few minutes later, they walked out. Ryan had pulled on sweatpants. Chloe was wrapped in a sheet. My sheet. Ryan spoke first. Natalie, I can explain. I took a drink of water. I'm sure you can. It's not what it looks like. I looked at him, then at Chloe, then back at him. It looks exactly like what it looks like. Chloe couldn't meet my eyes. Ryan looked guilty for about 3 seconds before something else took over. Defensiveness. The kind people use when they're trying to avoid responsibility. Then he said the sentence I still remember word for word. You're always at work, Natalie. What did you expect? For a second, I honestly thought I'd misheard him. Out of everything he could have said, that was what he chose. Not an apology. Not regret. Not even embarrassment. Blame. I stared at him. Then, to my own surprise, I laughed. A short, disbelieving laugh. Ryan frowned. What? I set the glass down. Fair point. Now both of them looked confused. Fair point, I repeated. I'm always at work. That must have been very difficult for you. His expression shifted. I could tell he was trying to figure out whether I was serious. So you understand? That question removed whatever doubt I still had about him. I looked at Ryan and suddenly felt like I was seeing him clearly for the first time. Not the version I'd defended. Not the version I'd built plans around. The real version. The one standing in my kitchen, blaming me for catching him cheating. I understand perfectly. Then I walked past both of them, picked up my laptop bag from the living room, grabbed my keys, and left. I didn't slam the door. I didn't say anything else. I just left. The drive that followed is mostly a blur. I remember traffic lights. I remember turning onto streets without really paying attention. I remember replaying the conversation over and over again. You're always at work. What did you expect? By the time I pulled into my friend Daniel's apartment complex, I had heard those words so many times in my head that they felt permanently attached to me. Daniel opened the door almost immediately. One look at my face was enough. Bad? I dropped my bag beside the couch. Worse. He stepped aside and let me in. After I sat down, I told him everything. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just the facts. I told Daniel exactly what had happened, from finding Ryan and Chloe in my bedroom to the unbelievable excuse Ryan gave afterward. When I finished, Daniel leaned back and stared at the ceiling. Wow. Yeah. A few seconds passed. Then he asked the obvious question. You okay? I looked down at my hands. No, he nodded. Good. I looked up. Good? If you were okay after something like that, I'd be worried. Despite everything, I laughed. It wasn't much, but it was the first genuine reaction I'd had since opening that bedroom door. Daniel pointed toward the spare couch. You can stay as long as you need. Probably a month. His eyebrows lifted. A month? I'm done. He studied me for a second. Then he nodded. Okay. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I found myself back in that bedroom, looking at Ryan, looking at Chloe, hearing that ridiculous excuse all over again. By sunrise, I already knew what I was going to do. Ryan thought the problem was that I'd caught him. I was about to discover the problem was that he'd forgotten whose name was actually on the lease. I woke up after maybe 3 hours of sleep. For a few seconds, I forgot what had happened. Then everything came rushing back, walking into my bedroom, seeing Ryan and Chloe together, and hearing the excuse Ryan thought would somehow justify it. My stomach tightened before I even sat up. I spent a few minutes staring at the ceiling, hoping the anger would show up. It didn't. What I felt was disappointment, the kind that settles deeper than anger because it forces you to admit you've been wrong about someone. By the time I got out of bed, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about logistics. That probably sounds cold, but practical problems have always been easier for me to handle than emotional ones. If a server crashes, there's a process. If a network fails, there's a process. Ryan and Chloe had blown up my relationship. Now I needed a process. The first call I made was to my landlord. The lease situation mattered more than either of them realized. Everything connected to that apartment came back to me. My credit, my deposit, my name on the lease, and ultimately my responsibility. And after what happened, I had no intention of carrying that responsibility any longer. The landlord had always been reasonable. We'd never had problems, and I'd paid rent on time for 3 years. When I explained that I needed to remove myself from the lease because of a major change in my living situation, he walked me through the available options. He walked me through the entire process, including the notice period, lease termination paperwork, income verification requirements, and a review of the remaining occupants. The more he explained, the clearer things became. Ryan and Chloe probably thought the biggest consequence was losing me. It wasn't. The biggest consequence was losing the stability I'd been providing without either of them appreciating it. Eventually, the landlord asked a simple question. Would the remaining occupants qualify for the apartment on their own? I almost laughed. No. He paused. Then they'll need a qualified cosigner. That wasn't happening. Ryan worked part-time at a coffee shop. Chloe worked part-time at a record store. The apartment rented for $2,400 a month. The income requirements weren't even close. When the call ended, I sat quietly for a minute. Not because I felt guilty, because I finally understood how much of our life had been resting on my shoulders. Ryan had spent months acting like he was doing me a favor by staying in the relationship. Meanwhile, I was the one keeping everything together. I was the one paying the bills, maintaining the apartment, making plans, and thinking about our future while Ryan simply assumed those things would always be there. He'd gotten so used to those things being there that he'd stopped noticing where they came from. I called the utility companies next. Both the electricity and internet accounts were under my name, and both would be transferred at the end of the notice period. Then I called Daniel. I need another favor. He laughed. You've been here less than a day. I know. What do you need? Can I stay for a month while I find a place? You already are. You sure? Natalie, stop asking. I smiled despite myself. Thanks. Don't thank me. Just don't move Ryan in. That got an actual laugh out of me. The first real laugh since everything happened. Over the next 2 days, I went back to the apartment twice while Ryan and Chloe were working. I wasn't interested in confrontations. I wasn't interested in hearing explanations. Anyone willing to cheat and then blame me for discovering it wasn't going to suddenly become honest. The first trip was for documents and essentials. I gathered all the things that suddenly mattered most. My passport, tax documents, work equipment, banking records, and anything else I couldn't afford to lose access to. The boring things that become incredibly important when your life suddenly changes. Walking back into the apartment felt strange. Nothing had physically changed. Ryan's mug was still beside the sink. Chloe's jacket still hung near the door. The furniture was exactly where I'd left it, but the place felt different, like a house someone else used to own. The second trip was larger. Daniel came with his truck. We loaded my gaming setup, office equipment, personal furniture, and anything I'd purchased before Ryan moved in. At one point, Daniel pointed toward the television. You taking that too? I looked at it for a second. Hundreds of movie nights. Countless evenings. Entire weekends spent sitting in front of that screen. Then I shook my head. No. Sure. Yeah. Some things weren't worth the effort. Before leaving, I sat alone at the kitchen counter for a moment. Sunlight was coming through the windows. The apartment was completely silent. I remembered signing the lease, buying furniture, making plans, imagining a future there. For a while, I genuinely believed Ryan would be part of that future. Now the entire idea felt ridiculous. I pulled out a piece of paper and wrote a short note. Lease termination notice incoming. You have 30 days. Good luck. Then I left. 48 hours later, the official notice arrived, and my phone immediately exploded. The first call came within minutes. Ryan. I ignored it. Then he called again, and again, and again. By the end of the night, he'd called 11 times. By the following afternoon, the total had reached 19. I listened to the voicemails while eating lunch at work. The first few sounded confused, then irritated, then angry, then desperate. By the last voicemail, Ryan sounded terrified. Please call me back. That was the moment something finally clicked. I hadn't panicked when he got caught cheating. He panicked when he realized the apartment was disappearing. Chloe approached things differently. Instead of calling repeatedly, she sent messages. Loon ones. The first messages focused on our friendship. Then came explanations. Then excuses. Then attempts to rewrite history. According to Chloe, she'd been lonely. According to Ryan, he'd been neglected. Somehow, both of them managed to write paragraphs that made themselves sound like victims. I read everything once, then archived it. People who refuse accountability usually keep changing their story. I wanted records. A few hours later, Ryan texted. Can we meet? No. Can we talk? No. You're being unreasonable. I stared at that message for a few seconds before laughing. The lack of self-awareness was almost impressive. Hal cheated. I blamed me. And somehow I was unreasonable. The next day, the landlord called. You're probably not going to be surprised by this. I already knew where the conversation was going. What happened? Ryan and Chloe came to the leasing office. Of course they did. They wanted to stop the termination. And? I explained they couldn't. The landlord sounded exhausted. Apparently they'd spent nearly an hour arguing, demanding exceptions, demanding alternatives, demanding solutions. The problem was there weren't any. Eventually, he'd explain the situation clearly. They didn't qualify. They needed a cosigner, or they needed somewhere else to live. Before ending the call, he added one thing. Honestly, Natalie, I think they assumed you'd change your mind. That stayed with me, because he was right. Ryan had always assumed I'd stay, no matter what happened, no matter how much I carried, no matter how badly he behaved. He genuinely believed I'd eventually come back and fix everything. 3 days later, I got another phone call. This one surprised me. Ryan's mother. The moment I answered, she started talking. What exactly are you doing to my son? No, hello. No introduction. Straight to the accusation. I listened quietly. Then I asked a simple question. Did Ryan tell you why the lease is ending? Silence. He said you two were having problems. Of course he did. I closed my eyes. He slept with Chloe. Nothing. He slept with my roommate. Still nothing. He got caught. The silence that followed was longer than anything she'd said. When she finally spoke again, her voice had changed. He didn't tell me that. I know. A minute later, she asked the question I expected. You're really not changing your mind? No. Even now, everyone seemed to think this was about anger. It wasn't. I wasn't ending the lease because I wanted revenge. I was ending it because I wasn't willing to keep paying for a life that no longer included me. That conversation ended quickly after that, and I never heard from her again. By the end of the week, my apartment search was nearly finished. Ryan and Chloe were scrambling to save their situation. I was building a new one, a better one, a smaller apartment, a shorter commute, a fresh start. The application was approved the following morning. For the first time since opening that bedroom door, I felt something close to relief. Unfortunately, Ryan wasn't finished creating problems. Because 3 days after I signed my new lease, he showed up at my workplace. And that conversation ended far worse than any voicemail ever could have. 3 days after I signed the lease for my new apartment, the receptionist called during a meeting. Normally, nobody interrupted meetings unless something genuinely needed attention. So when my desk phone lit up, I excused myself and stepped into the hallway. The receptionist sounded uncomfortable. Natalie, there's someone downstairs asking for you. I already had a bad feeling. Who is it? A short pause followed. Your boyfriend. Ex-boyfriend, technically. But correcting her seemed unnecessary. I closed my eyes for a second. Of course it was Ryan. I headed downstairs, hoping he'd at least have enough common sense to wait quietly in the lobby. The second I stepped out of the elevator, I knew that wasn't the case. Ryan was pacing near the entrance. I looked awful. Not heartbroken. Panicked. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair looked unwashed, and the dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't been sleeping much. The moment he spotted me, he started walking over. Natalie, what are you doing here? We need to talk. No, we don't. His face tightened immediately. You won't answer my calls. There's a reason for that. People were moving through the lobby around us. Employees coming back from lunch. Visitors checking in. Nobody was openly staring, but enough people glanced in our direction to make it obvious this wasn't the place for whatever conversation Ryan wanted. He lowered his voice. They won't let us stay. I looked at him. For a second, I honestly didn't know how to respond. Did he think this was new information? Did he think I'd somehow forgotten the entire reason we'd reached this point? I know. His expression twisted. We have nowhere to go. There it was. What struck me wasn't the lack of an apology. It was the fact that he was still talking about the apartment. Even now, his biggest concern wasn't what he'd done. It was where he was going to live. Every conversation somehow came back to the same thing. The apartment, the bills, and the comfortable life he'd gotten used to living. You should have thought about that before. We made a mistake. I shook my head. No, Ryan. His jaw tightened. No? A mistake is forgetting an appointment. A mistake is sending a text to the wrong person. What happened here wasn't a mistake. I looked away. That alone told me more than any explanation could have. By then, I'd already replayed months of memories in my head. Too many moments suddenly made sense. The movie nights, the private jokes, and all those conversations that mysteriously ended whenever I walked into a room. Too many things fit together. Too many things made sense now. We weren't trying to hurt you. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it missed the point entirely. Whether they'd intended to hurt me didn't change the outcome. They had. Ryan swallowed hard. We can fix this. No. We can go to counseling. No. We can start over. No. Every answer came easier than the one before. Not because I hated him, because I'd already accepted something he hadn't. The relationship was over. Ryan looked genuinely confused by that. Like he still couldn't understand why everything wasn't negotiable. Then I remembered something he'd said months earlier during an argument about my work schedule. You'll never actually leave me. You're too loyal. At the time, I thought he was complimenting me. Standing in that lobby, I finally understood what he meant. He'd never admired my loyalty. He'd depended on it. I thought I'd stay no matter what happened. I thought I'd keep paying bills, keep fixing problems, keep carrying responsibilities, keep forgiving him. You thought I'd stay. His eyes widened slightly. Natalie, you thought I'd find out and still stay. His silence said enough. For the first time since I'd walked into the lobby, he looked ashamed. Not because he'd cheated, because he'd finally realized I wasn't coming back. A long moment passed before he spoke again. I can't afford this. And I believed him. That was the sad part. Without me, his finances had collapsed almost immediately. Without me, the apartment disappeared. Without me, the safety net disappeared too. But none of that changed what he'd done. His eyes searched my face, looking for sympathy, looking for weakness, looking for the version of me that would have stepped in and solved everything. That version was gone. Finally, Ryan reached for my wrist as I turned to leave. It wasn't aggressive, but it crossed a line. I pulled my arm away immediately. At the same time, 2 security guards started moving toward us. One of them looked at me. Everything okay? I looked at Ryan, then back at the guard. No, that was enough. The guards politely informed him he needed to leave. For a second, I thought he might argue. Instead, he stared at me, like he still couldn't understand how we'd gotten here. Then security escorted him outside. I watched the doors close behind him, and for the first time since all of this started, I felt completely certain I was making the right decision. A week later, I moved into my new apartment. My new apartment was definitely smaller than the old one. The kitchen was tighter, the bedroom barely fit all my furniture, and the balcony could only hold a chair and a small table. Somehow, though, it felt bigger in all the ways that mattered. Objectively, it was a downgrade. Emotionally, it felt like an upgrade in every possible way. The silence was peaceful. Nobody was lying to me. Nobody was hiding things from me. Nobody was making me question my own instincts. For the first time in a long time, I felt comfortable in my own space. Around that time, updates about Ryan and Chloe started reaching me through mutual friends. Apparently things weren't going well. At first, they'd tried presenting themselves as a team. They were going to find another apartment, find a co-signer, figure something out. Reality had other plans. Landlords weren't interested. Applications kept getting rejected. Income requirements kept getting in the way. Eventually, the arguments started. Then they got worse. According to one friend, they'd had a screaming match in the parking lot over money. That didn't surprise me. Ryan accused Chloe of not contributing enough. Chloe accused Ryan of expecting everyone else to support him. Neither one seemed interested in taking responsibility for anything. Months earlier, they'd been perfectly united. The moment consequences arrived, they started turning on each other. Not long after that, I discovered something else. While reviewing my finances, I realized Ryan hadn't actually been paying everything he'd promised. Several transfers were missing. 4 months worth. $1,600 total. At first, I thought I'd made a mistake. Then I checked again. And again. Same result. $1,600. Gone. Looking back, the excuses were obvious. He'd always had reasons. Forgotten passwords. Banking issues. Payment delays. I was simply too busy and too trusting to notice. That discovery bothered me less than I expected, mostly because it confirmed what I was already learning. The relationship hadn't fallen apart overnight. I'd just ignored the warning signs for much longer than I should have. A few days later, Chloe contacted me. This time there were no excuses. No attempts to justify anything. Just desperation. She wanted me to talk to the landlord. She wanted more time. She wanted help. I listened quietly before giving her the only answer I had. No. She sounded exhausted. You really don't care what happens to us? I thought about that question carefully. I cared when we lived together. Silence. I cared when I trusted you. More silence. I cared when you were my friend. The conversation ended shortly afterward. 3 days later, the landlord informed them that formal eviction proceedings had begun. That was when the situation stopped being temporary. The apartment was gone. The deadline was real, and there was no solution waiting around the corner. A few days after that, Ryan called one last time. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he asked, "Are you happy now?" He sounded exhausted. Not angry. Just defeated. I looked out from my balcony and watched traffic move through the street below. No. A bitter laugh came through the phone. We'll probably have an eviction on our record now. I didn't answer. There wasn't really anything left to say. Eventually he sighed. You don't care. That's not true. The words came out more calmly than I expected. Ryan kept insisting. I didn't care, but that wasn't true. I'd spent 2 years trying to make the relationship work, covering bills when he couldn't, adjusting my schedule whenever possible, and trusting him even when I probably shouldn't have. I said I was sorry. No. What? You never actually apologized. I reminded him what he'd said when I caught him. You're always at work. What did you expect? I reminded him what he'd said when he came to my office. How he'd begged me to stop the consequences without taking responsibility for causing them. Eventually, he admitted something. The most honest thing he'd said during the entire situation. I didn't think you'd actually leave. I closed my eyes. I know. That was the heart of everything. Ryan never believed I'd walk away. He assumed loyalty meant permanence. He assumed I'd always stay, always forgive, always fix things. I was wrong. A few weeks later, everything was finished. The apartment was gone. The eviction became official. Ryan moved back in with his parents. Eventually, Chloe did too. Then I learned one final detail. The affair had been going on for 4 months. Once I heard that number, so many moments suddenly made sense. The movie nights, the private jokes, and all those conversations that mysteriously ended whenever I walked into a room. For 4 months, I had been the only person in that apartment who didn't know what was happening. Strangely, that information didn't make me angrier. It gave me closure. For a while, part of me wondered whether I'd acted too quickly, whether I'd given up too easily. Learning the truth erased those doubts. After hearing the full timeline, I stopped wondering whether I'd acted too quickly. Nobody accidentally carries on an affair for 4 months. That kind of betrayal requires hundreds of decisions, and neither of them chose to stop. I still work long hours. Hospital systems still fail at inconvenient times, and my phone still rings when I'd rather be sleeping. But when I come home to peace. I no longer came home wondering what I was about to discover, or whether I was carrying a relationship that only one person was actually working to maintain. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. I wasn't carrying anyone else's problems anymore, and I wasn't trying to save a relationship that only one person had been fighting for. After everything that happened, that was enough.